ladies and gentlemen. Welcome on in to a special interview edition of the PWTorch Fireside Chat. I'm PWTorch Assistant Editor Zack Heydorn, and with me today, critically acclaimed novelist Chad Dundas. Chad, so excited to talk to you. You've got quite the project coming out in August, and just looking forward to chatting with you about it. Welcome to the show.
Oh man, thanks, Zach. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm glad to be here.
Oh gosh, are you kidding? So the territories, what an interesting project. I of course could explain it to the audience here, but hey, I've got you on. Take a minute and then just set the table for what this territories project is, and then we'll get into some kind of artistic details about it in a minute. But set the table. What is this thing?
Sure, yeah. The Territories is a shared world fiction project set in the world of 1980s professional wrestling. And if that sounds confusing or unclear, it basically just means that my former colleague from Bleacher Report, Jonathan Snowden, and I, who is a good friend of mine, decided to create this fictional world set in kind of like a funhouse mirror version of the 1980s pro wrestling territories. And so he and I got together and created a loose framework of 16 different territories in the continental United States, based it on the real life territory system that controlled the professional wrestling world, from the 1940s essentially until the 1990s. And we created these fictional territories and thought of it as sort of like a framework for a world. And then we invited a bunch of different established authors that we were either friendly with or we had connections to come in and write different fictional short stories, all of them set in this same world. So basically it is an opportunity for a bunch of different people who work in different genres and styles and have different narrative styles and abilities to come in and tell a bunch of different kinds of stories, but all set in this one, cohesive world. So we hope that it's going to be a pretty fun project. It'll give, opportunities for a bunch of people to come in and do different things and have different takes on the situation. And so we're really excited to see sort of how it grows and progresses. Our first collection of short stories, as you mentioned, is going to come out in August, and we hope that that's just the beginning. We hope to be able to build on it and grow and just make it a big kind of cool ongoing thing for people who are interested in reading it.
It's such an interesting concept, given that it's fiction. There's just not too many works of fiction out there concerning the business of professional wrestling, and this is certainly interesting. So you've got like 16 stories that are going to be involved in volume 1, or no, excuse me, 10 short stories. Sorry. Do they connect with one another, or are they just set in the same time, or is there like a connective tissue storyline running through all of them?
Well, each of the stories can be read as a standalone thing. You don't have to read all of them to understand what's going on in each individual story, but there are characters that kind of come and go throughout the different stories. The way that I like to describe the world is that each of these different 16 territories that we created, they're kind of like planets in a solar system, in that the territories remain fairly separate, but the characters who inhabit those stories come and go throughout the various territories. You might read one story that is set in our Memphis territory, for example, and it might take place in 1985, and it would have a certain character in it. And then you might read a different short story that takes place in California or down in Texas, and it might take place in 1982, but it would have, one of the same characters might pop up. But this particular wrestler is working down in Texas at that period of time. So that's one of the cool things about it, is that it gives us the opportunity to build that connective tissue and to have these different characters kind of come and go throughout these territories as necessary. And of course, involved in creating the world, we created some people that would be considered all-time great figures in this world, like the Ric Flairs of this world, the Harley Races of the world, the Dusty Rhodes of the world kind of thing. And those guys they might show up all over the place and be these kind of like revered figures that are, talked about even if they're not seen. But then there are also a lot of much more minor characters that kind of come and go throughout the various settings of these stories.
What went into the development of the characters that are featured? Is that something that you kind of left in the hands of the contributors, or did you and Jonathan kind of like map those out and just said, hey, okay, you take this guy, you take this woman, et cetera, et cetera? How did the development of those characters come to fruition?
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. So during the process of creating these 16 territories that Jonathan and I went through kind of on our own, we did, like I said, create some of these towering figures, all-time great figures in this world. And, we mapped those people out, came up with some kind of skeletal biographies for those people that different authors could use basically as reference material. But then especially for this first volume of stories, we turned a lot of the creative license over to the individual authors. And we basically said, hey, like if someone hasn't already written about something, feel free to write about it and kind of make it your own and, portray each of these characters however you think works for your story. And then once we have an author come in and take on that challenge and write about those things, after that we consider it to be canon. So like if somebody writes a certain story that takes place in 1982, for example, and it says a certain thing about a character who's based on Ric Flair, then we try to take that information and make that part of that character's life story and biography. So we don't want people to change those facts after the fact. But, as long as you're the first person there, the first person to put boots on the ground, so to speak, we turned a lot of the creative license over to the individual authors because we wanted them to have fun with it, and we wanted to have the input of all of these different people and this diverse group of creators who would all bring, different opinions and different points of view to the table. So we really wanted to create narrative havoc in some ways. We wanted people to do their own things and just kind of see where we landed. That's part of the fun of the project.
How does so you've got a kind of a special piece in the territories, the Big Haas. How does that factor into the book, and where was the essence of that creatively to start things off?
Right. So I wrote a novella called The Big Haas, which is sort of the lead story in this collection, and hopefully will be the first thing that people read and the first story that people encounter in the territories. And in some ways, it's kind of designed as an entry point for people to get into this world. Mm-hmm. And as a writer myself, I have a bad habit of writing fiction about professional wrestling. I wrote a novel in 2016 called Champion of the World, which was a historical fiction novel about professional wrestling in the 1920s. And as a wrestling fan myself, it's one of the creative touchstones in my life. So I always come up with these wrestling fiction ideas, and I almost can't stop myself from writing about it, which is, I called it a bad habit because it's not like there are a bunch of traditional publishing houses out there really trying to get professional wrestling fiction. So I write these things, and then I kind of don't know what to do with them. So I wrote The Big Haas, which was a novella set in a backcountry 1980s territory in the Rocky Mountain west of the United States, which is kind of where I live. And so I had this novella, and I didn't really know what to do with it. And then I was kind of talking to Jonathan about that, sort of complaining to him that I had written this novella for reasons that I couldn't explain, and I expected that it would just live on my computer for its entire life, and no one would ever read it or see it. And he started telling me about this idea that he had basically for what became the territories, that was this shared world fiction universe set in these fictional wrestling territories in the 1980s. And I loved that idea. I thought it was super interesting. And so the very first thing we did was kind of adapt my novella, The Big Haas, into this new world of the territories. So we used it as kind of like the first touchstone piece that would start to set the tone and the world for what the territories would eventually become. And so that's kind of the purpose that The Big Haas serves in this collection. It tells the story of a young up-and-coming wrestler named Dallas, the real deal Hostetler, who's working kind of a bland cowboy gimmick in the early 80s in this, kind of Wild West, really, promotion. And he's a former Boise State football player, so he's got all the tools. He's big, he's athletic, he looks good, he's a good worker. But the thing that he struggles with is connecting with fans. He can't really tell a story out there, and he can't really get the fans to buy into his character. And so the promoter in this area teams him with a former big-time star who is, in terms of characters, is kind of like an analog of like if you mashed up Terry Funk and Randy Savage into one guy. That's who this guy is. And his job is to kind of mentor this younger guy. So the story is their friendship and their kind of trials and tribulations, riding the roads, making every high school gym and VFW hall between Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and Billings, Montana, kind of figuring out the ropes of wrestling and where they both fit in this world of the territories, which is also, changing really rapidly throughout the 80s and into the early 90s. So that's sort of the plot of the Big Haas. I'm excited now that people are going to get to read it because, like I said, when I first wrote it, I kind of didn't know what its commercial future was going to be. So I'm really excited that we found a platform for it.
That's wonderful. So interesting. So, where do you come? What's your perspective, I guess, just on professional wrestling? How long have you been a fan? I mean, I know you've obviously written about it for quite some time, but where did your fandom begin, and what do you watch presently?
Yeah, so I was really lucky in that I grew up essentially during both of what would be considered these modern golden ages of professional wrestling, right? Because I was a kid in the 80s during the rock and wrestling revolution, Vince McMahon taking over the world of professional wrestling on the USA Network and everywhere else. And so that was kind of my entry point with Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant and the Junkyard Dog and everybody else, and was a fan pretty much straight through probably until my early teen years, and then I kind of drifted away from it. But like I said, I was also in college during the Attitude Era. So wrestling kind of came back around to me, and I became a big fan again with a group of friends of mine, and we watched the entire, Monday Night Wars and the rise of The Rock and Steve Austin and Triple H and all these other guys, and then stuck with it in a more or less serious way. At this point, I'm a 44-year-old man with three really young kids who are kind of too young to really get into it. So I don't have a ton of time to watch all of the shows now. I can't keep up with everything that's going on with Raw and SmackDown and NXT and AEW and everything else that's happening. But I try to follow it kind of like at arm's length, especially with social media. I follow a lot of wrestling people. And so I feel pretty up to date on what's happening, but I don't actually have the time to sit down and watch, a 2 or 3 hour show or whatever it may be on a real regular basis. So I watch the highlights. I take in the videos that are on social media, and every now and then, if something really catches my interest, particularly if something new happens or there's something that I really want to watch, I'll seek it out and make the time to watch it. But it's sort of like I'm kind of keeping it at arm's length for the moment until maybe I have a little bit more bandwidth in my life to give it the time that it deserves.
Makes sense. I've got two little ones too, so I totally get it. So just kind of a fun question to wrap things up here. So outside of the character that you wrote for in the territories, who is your favorite one, given that you're one of the only people who have read this thing top to bottom? No spoilers or anything, but just what's a character that you like that people should look out for when they pick up a copy?
Yeah, there's a couple that spring to mind immediately. One might look and sound very familiar to wrestling fans, especially from the 1980s. A character that was dreamed into existence by my buddy Ben Folks, who wrote one of the short stories that's in this collection. The character's name is Doomsday, and he is a giant, ripped bodybuilder who comes out of the Florida bodybuilding scene, paints his face crazy, and becomes an instant sensation in our Memphis territory, where he is big and loud and cuts unintelligible promos, and he will run down to the ring, shake the ropes, get in there, press slam somebody, pin him, and then run out in about 2 seconds. And so he is poised to be a big star in professional wrestling. The only problem is he can't wrestle a lick. He doesn't know a wrist watch from a wrist lock, as the old timers would say. And on top of that, seems like he's kind of a jerk. Kind of treats everybody poorly in the back. And so he gets paired up with this veteran manager whose job is to try to show him the ropes and kind of break him into the business, and also maybe teach him the proper way to handle himself around the other guys. So that's one of my big time favorites. I don't know if that sounds familiar to anyone, but that's the character of Doomsday. There's another guy in the territories whose name is Damian Rex. He goes by the Dungeon Master, and he works in a cult gimmick, very similar to what someone would see from Kevin Sullivan back in the day. And he shows up in my novella, The Big Haas, and then he turns up in another short story, also in the same collection, in a different place and a different time. But that is also one of my favorite things that happens, because it sets the stage for what we want to try to do with the territories, where you have this sprawling, immersive world where you might meet someone in one time period in one place, and then they might unexpectedly pop up somewhere else. So that's another thing that I really enjoy about this particular collection.
Phenomenal. Well, great stuff, Chad. Really looking forward to check out the project when it comes out on August 1st. The Territories is available now for pre-order, so you can go to a special Indiegogo.com page. I'll put it up on the PWTorch Twitter as well as my own. But Chad, you've got a lot of other stuff going on too. Your work on the Co-Main Event MMA podcast, and just you've been everywhere. ESPN, The Athletic, Bleacher Report. You've got a couple books out. Kind of plug your stuff, and then also just kind of wrap up with where can listeners pick up a copy of the Territories?
Yeah, so everyone can follow me if they want to, just at Chad Dundas on Twitter. I'm over there pretty frequently. I do co-host a mixed martial arts podcast called the Co-Main Event Podcast with my friend Ben Folks, who I mentioned earlier. We have been doing that for 10 years, just had our 10-year anniversary. I am the executive producer on a history and true crime podcast called Death in the West, which is super fun and interesting. And if people have an interest in that kind of stuff, they should check that out. I have 2 books out for sale right now, which you can get or order wherever books are sold. As I mentioned earlier, Champion of the World, my historical fiction novel about professional wrestling, is out in paperback. People can go find that. And then I have a contemporary mystery and thriller called The Blaze, which you can get either on ebook or hardcover if you find that online, or you can order it through a bookstore. So if anybody is interested, they can go pick up those, which I would greatly appreciate. And of course, the Territories, as you mentioned, is available for pre-order right now at our Indiegogo page. The easiest way to find it is to just go to Indiegogo.com and search the Territories, or you can follow me on social media. I tweet about it pretty much incessantly, so if you follow me over there, you will see it. And it'll be out, as you mentioned, Zach, on August 1st. And after that, people will be able to order it through Amazon or order it at bookstores or wherever they like. But that's the whole pitch, man. That's where you can go find it if it sounds interesting to you. We would appreciate it.
Fantastic. Chad, thank you so much. Congrats on the project and the project coming out. And really looking forward to checking that out when it's available on August 1st. Thank you so much for your time.
You bet, Zach. Thanks for having me anytime.